All right, we'll go ahead and get started then. Everyone, thank you so much. This is our 12 o'clock panel. This is Microplastics in Unexpected Places. And we have a panel of all undergraduate researchers presenting today. So very exciting. I think that's a first for an AGU press conference. So our panelists today are Julia Davidson from the Desert Research Institute, Emmerline Ragoonath-De Mattos from Columbia University, and Meredith Sutton from the University of Virginia. And we actually have a physical sample that Emmerline brought in for her presentation of fabric samples. So if anyone would like to take a look at those or a feel of those, just come up to the front after the press conference is over.
Hi everyone, my name is Emmerline Ragoonath-De Mattos and I am an undergraduate student at Columbia University. This summer I interned at the Lamont Dorothy Earth Observatory where I worked with my partner Mariela Carrera, Senior Research Assistant Kaylee McKee, Dr. Helga Gomes, and Principal Investigator Joaquin Goes. What we worked on this summer was what is the role of microfibers from clothing in the aquatic environment and their impact on zooplankton. Now, before we get into microfibers, I just want to let you all know a little bit about microplastics. So what are microplastics? Microplastics are defined as plastics that are less than 5 millimeters. They are categorized as microbeads. These are spherical in shape, and they are generated from products such as facial cleansers and other pharmaceutical products. Another type would be microfragments. These are irregularly shaped, and they are generated from the photodegradation of larger plastics. So these are what the microfragments look like. And what I worked on this summer was the microfibers, and these are hair-like structures, and they are generated from our clothing. So each one of us contribute to the microfibers that are ending up in our oceans. Now, we know that microfibers are being shed through our clothing. But what we did not know was which type of fabric sheds the most amount of fibers. So our team and I, we set out to investigate this, and we partnered with Dana Cohen, who is a fashion designer. She was able to procure 33 different types of fabrics for us, and these different fabrics came from different countries such as Italy, China, Australia, and of course the US. And what we did, we wanted to launder these fabrics. Now, each fabric was treated similarly. They were both cut into 1 square foot by 1 square foot pieces, as well as they were hemmed. Now, next they were laundered both with and without detergents. Now, once they were laundered, the wash water was filtered, and we were able to determine the mass of fibers that were released within the wash waters. So, without the use of detergents, we saw that polyamide types of fabrics shed the largest amount of fibers, while polyethylene and nylon sheds least. So this is an image of the fibers that we collected from the wash waters. Now, once we used detergent, we saw that polyamides shed the largest amount of fibers, while recycled polyester shed the least. And this is another image of the amount of fibers that we collected from the wash water. Now, we categorized these 33 types of fabrics into 9 categories. They were hemp, polyethylene, biodegradable nylon, nylon, tensile, viscose, recycled polyester, and polyamides. Now, in this top graph here, the light orange shows the fiber loss, the average % of fiber loss without the use of detergent, and the dark orange shows the fiber losses with the use of detergents. Now, when you compare without detergent and with the use of detergent, we can see that the amount of shedding was almost 3 times with the use of detergent. Now, another part of our project, we wanted to determine the amount of lint that is trapped in the dryers, and we were able to determine these amounts. So the light green colors show without detergent, and the dark green color shows with detergent. And again, we can see that with detergent, there was more fibers that were being trapped in our dryers. Now, once we compare our washing process with our drying process, we can see that drying releases much more fibers compared to the washing. So just to give you a comparison, this here is our polyamides, and these are other fabrics that were tested. So polyamides here shed the most, both with and without detergents. Now, we wanted to know what about these detergents caused all this shedding, and then we wondered, what if detergent formulas actually contained microplastics themselves? So we partnered with the students of Uncommon Charter High School, and they tested these different brands of detergents. So these brands of detergents can be categorized as organic brands and regular brands. Now, in order to detect microplastics on a microscopic level, they used a dye called Nile Red, and what that does is under ultraviolet light, it fluoresces. So the images I'm about to show you, anything that you see fluorescing is considered a microplastic. So in the organic brands, these that glow are microplastics. And in our regular brands, these were the microplastics that were found. So these are contributing to the amount of microplastics that enter in our ocean. Now, at Lamont Dorothy Earth Observatory, we partner and collaborate with other scientists and other students. One such student, Shelley Lim of Barnard College, conducted a study within New York waterways, and she wanted to quantify the amount of microbeads and microfibers within different areas of the New York region. So from areas 1 to 7, this is the Long Island Sound area, and 8 through 14 were other areas within New York. Now, what is important to note is that the larger the dot, the more the microbeads and the more the microfibers. Other research included surface water samples. So here is the Connecticut River. Surface water samples were taken here. And this is other areas within the Long Island Sound area. Surface water samples were taken there. And we were able to see that there are a lot of microplastics, both all of them having fragments, fibers, and beads. So you can see that we have a large amount of fragments in both areas. Now, another part of this project included the Calanus copepod species of zooplankton. Now, this is a very low trophic level species of zooplankton, and in this region of the Long Island Sound area, we collected these species, and what we saw these amount of fragments, fibers, and beads that were within the bodies of these tiny organisms. Now, remember, this is a very low trophic level, so it means that other fishes feed on them, so it tells us that there's the possibility for bioaccumulation of these plastics. So thank you very much, and I would like to acknowledge some of these professors who helped me. I would now pass you on to Meredith.
Hello, everyone. My name is Meredith Sutton. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Virginia, and I've been working with Dr. Bartelt Hunt at the University of Nebraska, studying the occurrence and fate of microplastics in the agricultural environment. So this is primarily in response to the application of biosolids, which is an agricultural practice that I'll talk about more in just a bit. So, much like Emmeline's group, we're just trying to pinpoint a source of microplastics as they're entering the environment. And this is primarily because of their increasing prevalence in the environment and the possibility that they may have negative effects on different ecosystems and human health. So, when researching the distribution of microplastics over different types of environments, not only have we found indication of increased microplastic concentrations downstream of urban areas, so like cities, which was fairly expected. We also found indication of increased levels of microplastics downstream of agricultural areas. However, there's been little to no research on the type of agricultural practices that could be causing this increased level of microplastics. So our research group chose to study the land application of biosolids, and this is primarily because biosolids tend to have a high microplastic content. And so I'm going to give you guys just a quick kind of background on biosolids. Biosolids are a product of wastewater treatment plant sludge. So this sludge is the solid components that are left over after the wastewater treatment process, and then they can go through their own treatment process and then be land applied as fertilizers or soil amendments in agricultural areas. And so the issue with this is that when they go through this treatment process, it does nothing for the microplastics that the sludge have accumulated in the wastewater treatment plant, primarily due to the washing of fibers and things like that, as Emmeline discussed. So when they're applied to fields as biosolids, it's comparable to applying a concentrated source of microplastics directly back into the environment, which obviously is not good. So for this study, our main goals were to try to see if the application of biosolids resulted in an increased microplastic content in the runoff leaving these fields. And then we wanted to see if there was a certain size or shape of these microplastics that were more likely to end up in this runoff. And so the answer to both of these were yes. The land application of biosolids did result in higher concentrations of microplastics in its runoff, and there was a preferential shape that was transported, and I want to talk a little bit more about these in just a minute. So in order to get these results, we set up 4 test plots at Rogers Memorial Farm outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. And 2 of the plots were applied with biosolids to meet the nitrogen requirement for corn, which is a popular crop in the area. And then 2 of the plots were left as control plots, so no other soil amendments were added. They were just left alone. And so after significant rainfall events, we would collect samples and then analyze these samples using UV microscopes. And when these the UV light interacts with the plastics, it causes them to fluoresce a blue color, as you can see in this picture. And these are 3 out of the 4 microplastic shapes that we looked for. So these include films, fibers, and fragments. As Emily mentioned, the fibers and fragments, we were also looking for the microbeads as well, but they're not included in this picture. So, as I mentioned earlier, and our initial results were very positive, we did find that biosolids contributed an elevated concentration of microplastics into the runoff leaving these fields. And you can see this in these 2 bar charts that are for the 2 different types of runoff samples that we collected, both liquid and mixed samples. And so these charts show the microplastic concentration for each sampling date that we took after a rainfall. And the red bars denote the experimental plots. The runoff from these plots are the plots that have the biosolids applied. And then the blue denotes runoff from the control plots. And as you can see, for every sample during every sampling date for both the mixed and the liquid samples, the runoff from the plots with biosolids have a higher average concentration of microplastics when compared to those in the control plots. So this shows that there is an increased amount of microplastics leaving these plots. We also looked at the shape and size of microplastics and the runoff leaving these plots, and we found that the primary shapes leaving these plots are both fragments and fibers, with fragments having a much higher percentage than the fibers. And so this is going to help us categorize kind of the composition of the microplastics leaving these areas. Further, we also found that the fibers that we were looking at were all smaller than, primarily smaller than 2 millimeters in size. So this shows a more preferential treatment towards smaller microplastics. And if you think about that, that makes sense, because if the microplastic is smaller, then it's much easier, it takes less energy for it to be transported from its source. So in conclusion, we found that the land application of biosolids is an agricultural practice that contributes microplastic pollution to the agricultural environment, and then these microplastics can further be transported downstream and possibly end up in larger water sources like the ocean. And we also found that the microplastics transported from these areas are smaller fragments and fibers, and so this will help categorize the type of pollution, the microplastic pollution that's leaving these agricultural areas. And we definitely want to look further into the future and look at different agricultural practices to see where other microplastics are coming from in this environment. So I'll now pass it on to the next person.
Oh, no. All right. Hi, my name is Julia Davidson. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Nevada, Reno. So far, we've talked about how microplastics are entering the environment, but we haven't really talked about where they go after that. I've been working with the microplastics team at Desert Research Institute, and we were able to find microplastics in snow. And the snow that we looked at was remote areas, far away from any human contact. It was about at least 150 to 200 miles away from any human developments at all. And then on your left, you can see one blue fragment that we found within one of the snow samples in one of the pristine areas, like you can see on the right. So these environments, like the one up top, they look clean and they don't look very polluted, but when you zoom in really close, we end up seeing this contamination of different microplastic particles, like the one shown on the screen. The blue, larger particle is a fragment, and then the red one is a microfiber, and then we see another green fragment below. And it matters that we're finding these contaminants in the snow, because the snowmelt could be used for drinking water, which could be consumed by humans or animals, and we don't really know what health effects it would have if we were to be consuming these materials. Because these particles are plastic, they're going to be long-lasting, and they're not going to really exit the environment on their own. And for us to go in and to remove all of these microplastics would be very difficult, since they're so small and spread out so widely. So our process in this experimentation was we dug a snow pit and we collected snow from different layers within the snow pit. And then we filtered it through funnels into little filters, and we examined the particles on the filters with a stereo microscope. We imaged it and we magnified it, and then we examined the particles on the filters. You can see a fiber shown on the far right, and if you look at one of those squares are going to be about the size of a single piece of human hair, if that gives you an idea of how small these particles really are. We noticed a few things while looking at the data that we collected. The first one is that we noticed most of the particles were microfibers, like you can see below, and these could possibly be coming from clothing, as we discussed earlier. The second thing we found is that most of the microplastics were within the surface layer of the snow. We think that this may be because we think that the particles may be deposited onto the snow through the air, and the layer at top is going to have more time to have access to the air and have the deposition from the air as well as with the snow. As you can see in the graph, that top bar is the amount of plastics we found in the top layer, and then the layers below show the amounts we found in those ones respectively. So this is the second study ever to ever be done on the presence of microplastics within snow. The previous one examined microplastics within the Alps and the Arctic, and they also found a presence of microplastics in those remote locations as well. However, this study did not examine the different depths, so they weren't really sure of how the plastics were being deposited into these remote, faraway locations. And because of this, so as you can see, the different locations that all of the studies examined were very far apart. So we don't really think that this presence of microplastics in remote areas is regional. We think that this problem is widespread. We think that these microplastics are able to travel these long distances into these faraway areas because they're so small, which allows them to be traveled, or it allows them to travel across the great distances easier. Our results so far are very preliminary. We still want to examine more study sites and improve our methods, but we can say for sure that we are finding microplastics in these remote areas where we're not directly depositing them, but they still end up there anyway. These microplastics could then continue to contaminate fresh water sources, such as Lake Tahoe. My colleague Zoe, she examined collected a sample at Lake Tahoe, and she examined the filters, and she was also able to find a presence of microplastics there as well. And this is a problem because we don't really know the health effects that this presence of microplastics could be having on us and on the ecosystems. And this is a problem that matters because it's not really going to go away on its own, and it's really hard for us to go out and resolve since they're so small. So we want to know the magnitude at which it could be possibly affecting us. If you want to learn more about this topic, you could contact me or one of my colleagues, or you could look at our website that's listed below. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, panel. So now we will open it up for questions. Do we have any questions in the room?
I'm Rich Blaustein, freelance journalist. Thanks for real excellent and informative presentations. I learned a lot. I have a question about biosolids. I gather it's very new in terms of appreciating the problem, but is there any thought being circulated around in water treatment how to treat them?
So just to clarify, like treat the microplastics in the biosolids?
Before it goes into a biosolid fertilizer or anything of that nature.
Gotcha, yeah. So there is a pretty big push probably a couple of years ago on trying to figure out, so wastewater treatment plants became really closely studied because we thought that the effluent, so the water leaving the wastewater treatment plant, was going to be a really big source of microplastics. And as you saw from my study, we found that yes, there are a lot of microplastics leaving the wastewater treatment plant, and they still are, but a lot are also settling into the biosolids. And so there hasn't really been any research that I know of thus far that have looked at treating the microplastics in the biosolids, although there has been some research that looks at kind of trying to find different organisms to break down microplastics. But the problem with plastics really is that there's not really a good way to treat them at this point.
Do we have any more questions for reporters in the room?
Harvey Lyford, freelance. I'm wondering, Emmerline, if any comparable studies have been done on natural fibers, wool, cotton, I'm not sure what else, to see if there's a greater, lesser, or equal deposition of fibers into the washing machine, the dryers, and so on, and then into the environment.
You don't feel like
Oh, hi. I haven't come across any studies for organic fibers, but we did come across with other studies for synthetic fibers, and what those studies shows was that polyethylene sheds the largest amount, but in terms of organic, natural, I haven't come across any studies as yet.
Madeline Nash, freelance. Curious about the biosolids in agriculture, just as an example. And the question I have is, are the microfibers ever small enough to get into things like earthworms and maybe even through the root systems into plants themselves?
Yeah, so there's actually been some really interesting research that looks at how these microplastics are affecting kind of the microorganisms that live in soil, and they are one of the ecosystems that is affected by these microplastics pretty severely. There hasn't been any research on how microplastics might affect plants themselves, though. It'll definitely be an interesting area to look into, I think, especially in relation to agriculture.
I'm Tim McDonald from NPR. Julia, I'm wondering, this may be beyond the scope of the research you've done already, and I know you said it's really difficult, but I'm just wondering if you had ideas about how one might go about trying to clean some of those microfibers up. I mean, what might that look like? Or is that something that's even possible? Or once they're out there, they're out there?
So since these microplastics are so small and they're so widespread and traveling even further, which I was talking about, it would probably be pretty hard to go in and clean up, but what we can do is we can work on preventing our output of these microplastics or microfibers.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, Harvey.
Harvey Leifert, freelance. I wanted to ask Julia, the map you showed near the end of your presentation of 3 areas of the world, the Alps, the Arctic, and California, I guess. And you suggested that there had been transport of these microfibers from one place to the other, but I'm wondering why you assumed that rather than they be generated locally, more or less locally.
So I wasn't necessarily trying to suggest that they were traveling from the Arctic to the Sierra Nevada mountain range, but more so the locations that we looked in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, they're very remote areas. We chose areas that were at least 150 to 200 miles away from the sampling site that we collected our snow from. So they probably are local in the sense that they're coming from this region, but they're not necessarily being directly deposited into the areas we looked at, since they are hundreds of miles away from any human development.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Daniel Stolt, University of Arizona. I'm curious if you have any recommendations or resources what consumers can look at, for example, when I study the labels of body products, shampoos and stuff like that. I find it very difficult to figure out because they don't put microplastics on there deliberately. And same with clothing. Like, for example, are there resources where one can check which type of clothing, for example, is less of concern than others?
With respect to the clothing, I'm not sure of any resources that you can look at. I usually just check the labels, and you want to go for recycled polyester that actually shed one of the least amounts. You want to go, if you're going synthetic, you want to go with recycled polyester. The best thing you want to go for would be cotton, wool, silk. Those are biodegradable. There's biodegradable nylon, hemp. Those are what you want to check for. I usually try to check the labels before. With respect to the pharmaceutical industry, I know that by now there should not be any microbeads within these cosmetics because there was the 2015, the Microbead Free Water Act of 2015. So right now these formulas should not have any microbeads right now.
Do we have any questions on the chat? No? Do we have any more questions in the room? All right. If that's it, thank you so much again to our panel, and that concludes our press conference. So yeah, our afternoon is clear for the Bloomberg event. We are going to have a couple of roundtables in the press room at 2 and at 3:30. At 3:30 is our editors roundtable looking ahead to next year. And we'll resume press conferences tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone.